picture that we were describing a while ago. Look at the Ford Explorer. Its windows are already blown out. This is the gunman after he came out of the bank. This is the first of two gunmen that shot it out with police, and we're showing you this again to give you an idea of the type of firefight that took place about 9:50 this morning, about 50 minutes after these bank robbers were confronted. Now, this is the gunman. He's crouching. He starts to walk away almost nonchalantly, but look at him with his AK-47. Now he's starting to open up. Police, he's firing at police who are across the street in a parking lot. Now, he's walking. This is what makes me think he had body armor on, because this is a guy who is almost nonchalant in the way he's walking around in that parking lot.
Hello and welcome to Chaos Effect, the podcast that's only purpose is to talk about stuff that doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm McLain and with me today is...
Hello, I am Tyler Toledo.
We are both film majors with history minors.
Indeed.
So neither of us are historians. We're just kind of like... What?
I hope to correct that in the future, but...
Yeah.
Getting 2 degrees at the same time is not it.
Yeah, exactly. I feel the same way, but today we're actually kind of talking about fairly modern history. I want to specify we're not a true crime podcast, despite the fact we are starting with a crime. Today we're talking about the North Hollywood Shootout. So, on February 28th, 1997, it would start as a normal day at the Bank of America on 6600 Laurel Boulevard in North Hollywood until two men at 9:17 a.m. wearing body armor, wielding modified assault rifles, entered. This would be the beginning of the largest shootout in American history. So, Tyler,
Yes.
You said you did a little bit of reading on this. What do you think of this event?
So the first thing I thought of when I was doing my research on this, I'm like, wow, this is the intro to Grand Theft Auto 5.
I thought that too. I'm like, it sounds. Oh, this is Grand Theft Auto.
Yeah, it's very reminiscent of that opening scene with the bank heist. I mean, obviously that version was a lot more graphic.
This is like really weird because it's like one of those rampages, like that dude who stole a tank or that dude who built a tank, but it's also not, because like it was a bank robbery, and like we'll get into it, but like there's a lot to talk about with the backgrounds of these guys, because these are two very interesting individuals. And like, I don't mean to sound mean, but these guys are like that type of person who thinks that they're really smart at something but aren't. Right. Because I'm not again mean to sound mean, they're not successful guys.
I mean, you don't need to sugarcoat it. They're bank robbing criminals.
Yeah, and like me and you have politics that I'd say are left to center.
Yeah.
And I feel like in our spectrum, there's a tendency to defend perpetrators against the police. These guys are kind of just criminals. Like, I don't think these guys had multiple attempts at reform and trying to go on, but like they didn't. So let's get into the background. So the first perpetrator I really want to talk about is Larry Phillips Jr. Just very interesting, troubled person. He was plagued by a pattern of criminal activities in his life, and he was born on April 18th, 1969. He'd be the son of Larry Phillips Sr., a man with a checkered history. When Junior turned 6, he was arrested for the police, possibly tipped off by Junior's mother, Dorothy Clay, for his history of being connected to organized crime. He would later be released into his son's life again. And like most divorced dads, he would spend his time doing things like taking his son to wrestling matches, go to shooting ranges, and go camping in the Rocky Mountains. During these excursions with his son, he had often expressed his distaste for law enforcement and the establishment. This would contribute heavy to Junior's behavior. So, what do you think of that bit right there? That foreshadowing at all?
It always comes down to a troubled childhood and a checkered past.
America's history is defined by daddy issues. Like let's just be frank about it.
It's always that, and it's really kind of hard. It's heartbreaking to think about how people can be so corrupted by their influences, and how just some people are just straight up unlucky with their circumstances of
Yeah.
birth, and how that much like leads them down a dangerous
Yeah,
path.
but like apparently he was never like poor or broke. He just had like kind of a scummy upbringing.
Yeah.
That's the weird thing about this. He was never poor or broke. So Philip's school career ended very shortly when he dropped out in the ninth grade to pursue his true passion, to get rich. And there's nothing wrong with dropping out of high school and like maybe getting your GED, but I never found evidence that he got his GED or pursued any education outside of essentially ninth grade education. And I think that also says a lot about this individual. They assumed he could get rich without putting in a lot of work and towards anything else. So he'd also meet his next passion in the following year, bodybuilding. He didn't just like bodybuilding, he was obsessed with it. He wanted to be a legend, like the next Schwarzenegger. He wanted it to make him famous. But if you can tell from the title of this podcast, we're not talking about famous bodybuilder Larry Phillips Jr. Phillips would also become fond of get-rich-quick schemes, watching many infomercials. In September 1989, he'd begin his own criminal record. He was arrested for stealing $400 worth of suits from a Sears in Alabama. In the same year, his wife Sharon Santos would become pregnant with his son. Yeah, there seems to be a pattern in his life. And like this Phillips lifeline of kind of being a scumbag who knocks someone up and goes to jail.
So this is the first time.
It was also around this time Phillips would befriend his potential partner in crime, Emil Matasarono. I might pronounce his name wrong. Matasarono.
I didn't even attempt to try to understand how to pronounce it. I just saw that. I'm like, yep.
I'll be calling him Emil throughout this podcast, which is his first name, because I feel like I don't want to butcher his last name through the entirety of this podcast. But we're going to come back to Emil later because Phillips has a lot of his own schemes by himself that kind of define him as a person. So on Phillips in September 1992, there's also a pattern with September with these guys.
Interesting.
1992 would begin his first big crime scam. So this was a very complicated and also convoluted. Phillips began his scam by contacting local real estate agents in Colorado. He'd go check out the properties. He would remember the codes for the lock boxes. He would purchase these properties, then sell them very quickly and try to make it seem like he had purchased them and rented them. This is illegal to do, by the way, because like he was technically like leasing them, or I guess, but it's very. I couldn't find a lot of specifics on this, but basically he was running a housing scam, and it was very illegal. So he would later get caught when a detective traced his dead mother's car back to him. And he went to jail with the bail posted at $1 million. His wife, Sharon Santos, would take out her entire life savings of $10,000 to bail him out. This would put a strain on their relationship. And however, he would leave before he could be sentenced, knowing that he was probably going to go to jail. So at this point, he has kind of full circle become his father.
Damn.
So that's, for the most part, that is Larry Phillips Jr.'s early life. You have any thoughts on Larry there?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. It emphasizes the importance of education in one way. Getting rich. I mean, this is just like this is the American ideology. You gotta you gotta work for it. And you can't. And there's so many people that get rich by pursuing their dreams, and there's a lot of people that drop out of school to do that. But it seems like he didn't have a plan. He kind of just thought it would just happen. And a lot of what you learn and how you build your career comes from you just absorbing more information. Some people just get lucky, but you can't bank on the fact that you'll just get lucky with no plan. And it's kind of it's a lot of that story is just tragic.
Yeah, he's definitely like he's a type of person that I think like a lot of people like the meme of the guy like the Kyle, that type of dude.
Mhm.
He's very like these guys both are very much like that, but on very different ends. But he seems like the type of dude who, and like if it wasn't for the fact he was committing crimes, would be like living with his parents even though he didn't finish high school, talking about like how he's gonna get rich off of, like basically a pyramid scheme, and like he's just shotgunning like a Red Bull or a Bang all the time.
Yeah.
To me, the other interesting thing is like his first crimes aren't violent at all. Which like give it well, like we're gonna get into it in a little more when we talk about some of the crimes these guys both made together. But I find it very interesting. None of his crimes are violent. He really never showed any like initial risk taking or anything like that. He seemed like almost just kind of like going through the motions of things and just wasn't a good decision maker.
Right.
So you ready to talk about our friend Emil now? I shouldn't call him a
Absolutely.
friend. He's a monster.
Good old Emil.
So I mean, he's a bit different than his American counterpart. And I said his American counterpart because Emil was born in Romania. He was an overweight child. Generally like not very healthy. It had an epilepsy condition which caused him headaches and seizures, and that's going to become important later on in this story, or like when we're talking about the aftermath. His father Viral and his mother Valerie would leave the country when I don't know if you know this, but Romania has a dictatorship.
Yes.
And this is actually like it's not funny, but it's like his father's only job description was political dissident, which is not something you want to be if you live in the country with a dictator.
Yeah. That's the
They'd end up.
occupation.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, like, imagine your occupation. Like, you put that on a resume, like, oh yeah, I'm a political dissident. Just trying
What
to
do
get
you
in.
do here, sir? I'm an anarchist. That's our job. Oh, let me think of that. Now there's some accounts that say his mother was an opera singer, but again, this is all kind of he said, she said. Like the thing about these guys is they were pretty much nobodies until they committed to their crimes. So it's actually really hard to find a lot of information about their individual lives and a lot of it be confirmed. So I'm sure anybody watching this will probably be like, "Oh, you got this part wrong." Well, nah, I didn't have a whole lot to work off of. So they ended up in LA and they had a large house, like a really big house, because you know how American houses are. Like you don't have to have a lot of money and you can live in a huge house.
Yeah, unless you live in New York.
Emil really liked this and had a really big interest in big houses and like very fancy, expensive things. He liked this like American style life. However, this is kind of like the end of good things for him coming to America. He was the victim of a lot of bullying. I say victim because like I couldn't think of like target, I guess, but and mostly came to the fact he was overweight and he was also like he had a very foreign accent. So yeah, instead of friends, he would kind of do like the dangerous people to our society would go on and do in the future today, and got very fond of computers and would stay in his house working on them all day. He also helped his mother get her state care license, so um, for disabled adult care. And I think some people I went into a lot of forums and read it and talked, and I think some people read this as Emil must have been disabled or like been special needs or something. I don't think he was. I found no evidence thinking he was. I just think he didn't make good decisions and was easily influenced by other people, and we'll get into that. So Emil would only ever have a small group of friends in his life, and this is a pattern that continues till his death. And his parents around this time would also have a falling out, which ended in divorce, which apparently had like the law involved with people getting arrested, and they lost all their money, and his mother lost her state care license. So it like very tragic. Like I think like I talked about how Larry Phillips, he was like kind of tragically affected by his father to have a criminal nature because his father was a criminal, so therefore like he kind of saw his idolized his father. I think Emil was just a very unfortunate character here. I don't know what your thoughts on this so far are.
Yeah, I I tend to agree with that. The thing is like number one, I said it earlier. They always have a tragic backstory or a troubled past, but it also too, it's also money. This dude seemed to have a lot of and both of them seem to have a lot of financial problems, and obviously financial problems when you think about what happens later, you know where you can get a lot of money? Banks.
That's that's gonna be a really interesting part of this story. So, because like I like you're onto something, but also it like kind of takes the 360 with what you think. So Emil was apparently fairly smart. He enrolled in DeVry Institute of Technology. He chose to take a 3-year course on electronics engineering. Um, so basically, like working on things like radios and computers. At this time, Emil would attempt to widen his interest. He purchased a Kawasaki GPZ 550, which is like a really fast sports. Like you live in New York, right? And
Yep.
you know, driving on the Tappan Zee, you ever see those guys on those really fast bikes weaving through traffic all the time?
Oh yeah.
Like, and you hate them because, like, in some sense, they're just like they you're driving and like you're changing lanes, and one of these guys zooms. I'm like venting. I shouldn't be venting. Anyway, so he drove that. He also spent a ton of money uh to get fixed up by a mechanic named Kenny Beras, and one of the people that would come across him never really says much. I wrote down his name, think he would contribute more, but he never does. It's just he's the guy that happened to fix up his bike. Um, but he wasn't good at riding bikes. He was often left in the dust by his friends, and he wasn't described as not being good at by the people who rode with him. Um, he's like, so I don't know if you had this experience. Like, I don't know what, like, besides filmmaking, like me and you are both filmmakers, and we might kind of know this guy with film, but you know the guy who shows up with like a new equipment for like hunting or fishing or golfing or even film, and then sucks at everything, but he has the newest stuff all the time. He's a lot like that. Like he's a lot like that at this point. Um, so in 1987, he finished his degree and started a business that there's not a lot I can find about this business. It kind of sounds like it was like he fixed electronics in his house and did some other stuff with computers, but there's not a lot. Like I said, it's very hard to find a whole ton of information on these guys. And it's also hard to tell if it was successful or not. However, in this time, he'd also have a growing interest in firearms.
Oh.
Yeah,
What's
his
that?
neighbors had reportedly seen him clean several, and it seemed like I think it's a red flag for me whenever somebody's biographies, and then he had an incredible interest in firearms.
Yep. That almost always goes down south.
Like literally, like we live in America, and to anybody who's watching this, like, doubt anybody outside of America will watch this. We have a problem with guns.
What? We love them.
I mean, me and you live in fairly blue states. Well, you do at least. I live in like the reddest part of a kind of blue state.
Wasn't 49.7% of your state would agree with you.
It's scary how close that was. Pennsylvania being a decider like it was should never happen in American history.
Yeah.
I don't know who decided to give us that kind of power, but okay.
Just having a lot of people gives you lots of votes.
Yeah, and like I'm gonna be pretty transparent. I've grown up around guns, but I would never say I'm like obsessed or incredibly or like I know a lot about them, but I'm never like cleaning my guns where my neighbors can see me. One, because I don't have neighbors. Two, because I don't want to seem crazy. Like if we clean our guns, we would put our blinds down because we don't want to like scare people. Because we like we don't want to scare people. I feel like that's common practice for most people. Some people are crazy, and I think this guy he wanted people to know he had this stuff, like the motorcycle, the guns.
Oh, yeah.
So good news.
Having
In the
guns is
time
a
he had
big
gotten
flex.
guns, his parents would also become more toxic in their hatred of each other, and this would kind of affect Emil. You seem like you had something you wanted to say. What was that?
No, I'm just that was like a private thought because it was just like, of course, he has his parents have issues with each other. This is like classic supervillain origin story.
Yeah. So his father wanted nothing more but for Emil to go back to school and like get a full degree. Because I don't think he actually ever got a full degree. I think he just took a few courses so he could learn how to do this stuff. Which not a problem with that. I know a lot of people go to community college to do stuff like that. Like, oh, I want to know how to do this, so I'm just going to go to community college, pay for that class.
Yeah,
Um,
makes sense.
he at this time also kind of started having really violent outbursts. And I know what you're thinking, Tyler. How violent could it be? Like, did he punch somebody? One time, he reportedly started swinging a chainsaw in his neighbor's face. And what do you think, like, is deserving of that, right? Like, you would have to do something really drastic to cause that. Take a guess, please.
It's got to be really silly.
His neighbor's dog walked on his lawn.
That's sillier than I
Emil's
thought.
out here swinging the chainsaw around like the Doom guy because like somebody's poodle like might have peed on his yard.
I'm just imagining the scene in Texas Chainsaw Massacre where Leatherface is just like dancing around this chainsaw.
Oh, like that ending scene.
Yeah.
I'm like imagining just being the neighbor across the street who's like drinking your coffee, waking up, and you're looking out your front porch, and you just see one neighbor waving a chainsaw, there, a guy like kind of holding his dog, running away. Like, I need to get out of this neighborhood.
See, in my head, I'm like, oh, maybe his like car was like parked in the wrong spot or something.
Anyway, so Emil started getting interested in getting in shape and would start going to Gold's Gym. Guess who he met at Gold's Gym?
Is that Larry?
Larry Phillips. So, and they would become friends, sharing a lot of interests, like guns, you know. So after Phillips pulled his housing scheme in Colorado, he'd spend some time with Emil, and we will get into that in a minute. But so, what do you think of Emil's backstory and tendencies from what we've gone into so far before we get into some more stuff starting? Because I'd say this is the last point where maybe there was turning back points for any of them. Pretty much over here, they went on a course to do what they would do. Like, this is definitely the turning point, meeting each other.
And it really makes sense that these two would be friends.
It didn't or does?
It does.
Yeah.
Like they seem to have they're different enough, but they have the amount of shared interests that they have, and a lot of their backstories coincide. So I'm very not surprised that these two would grow close, and given their history of crime and
Violence.
yeah,
Despite
that relationship grows. And
despite the fact that Phillips seemed more criminally inclined, it seemed like Emil was more violently inclined in his life.
Yeah,
like I said, swinging a chainsaw around in your neighbor's face.
there's a symbiotic relationship. One influences the other, and it just grows.
So this is the last part about Emil's life, and I think this part really kind of shows the effect that meeting Phillips would have. So after this, he'd go back to Romania to bring his grandmother back to America. This is where he met his wife, Christina, who'd mother his son. Now, apparently Phillips, and again, this is one of those things where I saw some sources said this did happen, some that said didn't. But I kind of believe this happened given the effect Phillips had on Emil's life. Apparently, Phillips pressured Emil to marry her, but I can't find, like I said, I can't find much proof that this actually happened. So apparently it's like, oh yeah, you need to marry a Romanian woman. You should definitely marry a Romanian woman, which seemed really weird to me. But it also is like, I don't know if you've ever talked to kind of a rednecky scumbag.
Yeah.
And I kind of believe Phillips was one of those guys, and I could definitely imagine somebody like him saying that. It's like, yeah, you're this insert background here. You need to marry somebody from there. Like, okay. I don't know why you feel that, but okay. He'd have a kind of normal stints of life, except he wouldn't because now he knew Larry Phillips. So let's talk about their criminal history record before they committed the big one. So, the two kind of ran off together after Phillips, like, hey, I committed some crime. We need to get the fuck out. So on 1993, July 20th, the two robbed a First Bank armored car in Colorado. No one was killed. And so, yeah, we'll talk about like their like overall death tally at the end of the episode. But at this point, no one was killed here. The two would later be pulled over at a gas station after trying to flee from the police. Essentially just like so it was a rental car and it came up with suspicious plates being linked to this crime. Phillips was asked for his license, but didn't want to give up the cop his license because, Phillips was a felon. Emil would claim the car belonged to Phillips' mother, which was a lie because it was a Thunderbird they'd rented. The cop knew this was also a lie, I want to say, because he ran their plates. Like, I don't know if you know this, but cops can just do that really easily. It doesn't take them a whole lot. And it's like, oh, this is a rental. So he told him, as cops do, get out of the car, especially when they think you're doing shady shit. He found both men were both armed with Glock 17s. And they would both be arrested. Real quick note about the Glock 17. I don't know if you've ever heard this myth, but there's a myth that the Glock 17 is called the Glock 17 because it holds 17 rounds. It's not. That's just the model number. It has nothing to do with it holding 17 rounds.
Yeah, I've never heard that myth, but all guns have, or not. I don't know about all guns, but most guns that I know have like some random number at the end, and I've never assumed that it was the ammo count. So the fact that that myth exists is interesting because I never even would have considered that.
It's up there with things I hear like, oh, AR doesn't sound for assault rifle. Yeah, but it's kind of become that nomenclature. Yeah. So this car search is by far far more interesting than their arrest. In the car, they'd find a Polytech semi-automatic rifle, a Norikano Mac 90, which is like a Chinese-made gun, a semi-auto rifle, a Springfield pistol 45, a Colt 45, 1,649 rounds of 7.62 ammunition, 967 rounds of hollow point ammunition. So, and also 357 rounds of 45 ammunition. So, do you know the nickname for hollow points?
I don't.
The cop killer round. It's actually illegal in a lot of states because of
Oh.
that. So, hollow points basically what they do is they're hollowed out on the tip because they're meant to expand once they hit their target. Versus full metal jackets, which pierce through things. So when they expand, they kind of explode, making it there's no exit wound. Instead, you just have this really big entry wound. Because of that, like they were used by criminals specifically to kill cops. So that's their nickname. So really interesting thing that comes up later. 6 smoke bombs they also found, 2 improvised explosive devices, a gas mask, 2 sets of body armor, 2 programmable radio scanners with earpieces, sunglasses, gloves, wigs, ski mask, and a stopwatch. They also found 2 gray cans of spray paint, basically, with 3 different license plates and a sum of $1,620, which I don't know if they had purchased other stuff after the robbery, but it doesn't seem like it's worth that much to rob something. If that, like, you spent so much money on all this other stuff, the money you gain doesn't seem to be that much worth it.
Yeah, I mean, dudes were absolutely strapped. So
yeah, like that's a lot.
It honestly seems more like a long-term investment. Like,
yeah, I think you're right about that.
We're right back at it.
I think they got caught a lot earlier than they thought they would because, like I said, they had license plates to change on. I think that paint was to spray the car so they can, keep reusing the car. So on October 26th, The same year, both men were charged with robbery and firearm-related charges because, like, there's a lot of laws about having guns, like illegally modified to fully automatic rifles. Um, However, the charge of grand theft auto was dropped in court. I don't know why, but it just said it was. Philip spent 990 days in prison, while Emil only did 71. Each man received 36 days of probation. And that's the end of the story. They learned their lessons, and nothing bad ever happened again.
Nope, nothing.
On July 14th, 1995, around 12:25 p.m., the two men would rob another Brinks car. This time they would kill the driver and leave the other guard injured. So I'm going to say something. The Brinks driver here is the only confirmed kill they would ever have in their criminal history. And I think this is really interesting because I know I said earlier that meeting Phillips was the turning point for Emil, but I think this was the turning point for both of them because I don't know if they intended on killing somebody.
I mean, I don't know. It's hard to tell.
Like, the fact that they probably could have killed that cop who pulled them over or the guys in the first robbery really makes me think they weren't like out for blood. I also do want to mention at this time there was another robbery, armored truck robbery they committed. Both drivers were fine, but I don't think it was them this time because it was a very different kind of car than was used in their other crimes. In 1996, on May 2nd, they would graduate to bank robbery when they would storm a Bank of America in Los Angeles before 10 and stole $755,000 worth of, $1,000. So that's their first bait. Like that, as you can tell, that's a big increase. They do this again, robbing another Bank of America, this time getting away with almost $800,000 and injuring the two bank tellers. Now, hold on. Before we get into so the thing is, they were getting close to $2 million, and they expected to hit around $1 million per robbery. But banks don't actually keep a lot of cash because they get robbed. And we're going to talk about why Friday's a significant day for robbing a bank in a moment. But first, I kind of want to talk about like bank robbery is a really big crime. And banks have let's talk about the logistics of how banks work for a second here. So when bank robberies start happening and they don't catch the person the first time, banks start taking precautions. Like, Tyler, are you familiar with any of this here?
Not really actually. The only knowledge I have of like actual bank robberies comes from movies, so obviously that's not the most informed stance to have.
Yeah. So one thing banks do is they move the days which they move money. So like if somebody robs them on a repeat day, they get less money. The other thing they do is they take precautions, like make sure people don't have certain keys at the bank. And usually standard procedure is to hand over the money because you have insurance when you keep your money in a bank, and so does that bank. So as weird as it sounds, it's not like bank robbery is bad, but it's also not like people are heavily affected by this. And the other thing they do is they start taking precautions like leaving dye packs in money. And we'll get back to that later. So let's talk about the preparation for the big one. The two men had recon the Bank of America on 666. Not 666, on 6600. Crap, I don't have the name in front of me. Laurel Boulevard extensively. These guys were really they wanted to do this right. They thought this was going to be their big one. I think it's really important to say they thought that this was going to be the one that made them like really rich, considering what would happen. So They had a pretty extensive list. They had an HK-91, two Norcano Type 56 rifles, which is basically like a Chinese AK-47, a Bushmaster XM15 dissipator, all of which were legally converted to fire fully automatic. They also had homemade bombs using jars of gasoline that they were going to use to destroy the evidence in the car that they were going to use. Both had bulletproof vests. Phillips had a groin protector too, and some other armor he had made himself. Emil did not have some of the extra armor. Both of them were wearing ski masks with like a modified gas mask thing in them. They also had sewn watches into their gloves, which I guess I kind of get that they did that, but I also kind of like if you had your watch here, I don't think that makes a difference. Maybe it's just because you didn't want. I don't know why they did that, but I think maybe it was like a weird.
It's
thing.
creative.
Yeah, it's creative, but anyway, so 9:17 a.m. would be the first report of both men entering. These guys aren't stealthy. Like their MO was they were heavy hitters. They came in with a lot of firepower and they were leaving with a lot of firepower. They would force customers back into the bank. They were trying to leave, like, people at the ATM. Like you go to your bank, how like the ATM sometimes is like not exactly inside, but not exactly outside. It's like in that like little.
They have like a little like special area just for the ATM.
Mm-hmm. So they would like the people there were getting forced inside by these two guys. One guard was like kind of forced on the ground, and he like called for the other guard who just happened to be on like break outside to call the police, which he did, and the police arrived on scene with possible 211 in progress, which is code for the. Now, like I feel like it's stupid to say this, but like things like 211 mean something different in every area. So like when you police use codes, they usually use it specific to their district or county or city. So 211 in this case is a bank robbery in process. So Phillips was kind of taking the role of the leader, which I think was the dynamic, yelling, "This is a fucking holdup." Emil fired into the ceiling. Both of them would then, they were trying to scare the crowd because, like, you want that control in a bank robbery. Not that you should ever rob a bank. Please, nobody rob a bank who listens to this. They shot the bulletproof door open, which I feel like is kind of like saying, yeah, so the tow truck flipped over, or yeah, the fire station's on fire. The bulletproof door was meant to stop some handgun rounds. Like, have you ever been to a bank?
Yes, I've been to a bank.
That was a stupid question. But like, you ever like, I feel like you live in New York, so you probably see a bit more of this, where there's like the bulletproof glass and the thing that you can like only kind of fit your hand in, and then there's like the door that like only locks from the inside.
I think I know what you're talking about, but in the pandemic world, I haven't been outside of very much, so it's been a while since I've been to a bank.
I haven't been inside a bank, but I just have like a photographic memory for this crap. Anyway, so it basically was like that. So that got shot open because they're using assault rifles. So this is kind of where things start going down for Emil and Phillips. Besides the fact they're criminals, they were expecting to get their standard $750 pay. Now, before we go into why they were expecting, so a little thing before the age of the internet, when you could do things like instant checking through your phone or like take a picture of your check, you'd have to go to the bank, especially with like large deposits and withdrawals. And if you wanted cash for the weekend, because like credit cards weren't in, like, even though this was the 90s, weren't standard, or neither were debit cards, to get your money, it wasn't easy to get it on the weekend. So you'd often have to do things like make your deposit that day. And because of this, banks would usually have a lot of money on Fridays so people could make large withdrawals. Anyway, our two dudes enter expecting that to happen, right? Because of their robberies that they've done, Bank of America, keep in mind they're robbing the same brand every time, had only $300,000 around there there. Phillips was pissed by this. He began shooting into the vault, emptying all 775 rounds of his magazine into the vault door. and China like was demanding like to get access to the ATM and other things and asking where the money was. Now when he asked for access to the ATM, you think, oh yeah, that would be smart, rob the ATM. People who work at the bank don't rarely have access to the ATM. And it's kind of because a lot of the crimes that happen around this area, I don't think it was specifically these guys who inspired that, but because of things like bank robberies, they didn't want robbers to get access to the ATM. So they would lock the hostages in the vault and then make their exit. This is where the shit gets real. Before they had left the bank, the police had already showed up. The police were expecting 2 armed suspects to exit, and they had cornered them off successfully. They knew they had high-powered rifles. Now, something I didn't mention is they were wearing body armor. They had also taken a sedative that had been prescribed to Emil to calm their nerves. It also does things like slows down your blood flow, making it harder for you to bleed out, and kind of makes you more pain tolerant. That's going to be important in Grundon's next part. Both men would exit out separate doors and unleash fucking hails of fire onto the police. The police were not ready for this at the time. And so I feel like me and you aren't used to seeing police officers not looking like they were ready to invade Iraq.
Yeah, no, those cops are absolutely strapped.
Cops then, though, were a little different. Most cops didn't have vests that can stop more than a handgun round if they had vests. And they also, how do I put this? Their cars weren't really armored. Like, you ever watch a movie and you see the guy hiding behind a car?
Yeah.
Unless you're hiding behind an old car or a semi truck, that's probably not going to protect you from bullets. Because most handgun rounds will punch through the door, while most rifle rounds will punch through the entire car. Because it's not exactly really strong metal. Get behind the engine block if you're ever being shot at. So because of this, the officers were instantly under fire. Yeah, so they're just very few. They had no more than handguns, and they were going up against guys with AK-47. So immediately, several cops were injured upon these guys exiting. So were 3 civilians. A few civilians would get shot throughout this entire endeavor. At this time, too, there was a dentist across the street who was like that. Those above store dentists, like the second floor doctors.
Yeah, I go to one.
Yeah, the doctor's office who's above something else. It was one of these guys. I don't really mean to sound insulting because I'm sure this is fine, but you ever watch The Simpsons?
Yes,
Dr. Nick?
I think so.
He's a little bit of a shady doctor.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody.
Yeah.
This guy really reminds me of Dr. Nick when I see an interview because he does have the kind of similar accent. But he's a hero, this doctor, because immediately after these guys start shooting, he would start treating patients. Because even dentists or vets usually have some base level of medical care. Similar understanding. So your dentist generally knows a few things, how to stop bleeding and things like that. So it was really good that this dude was there. But let's talk about what the cops were armed with. So Tyler, what do you think the cops have that could stop this? Not like the SWAT, just your standard corner of the street.
Police. They would probably have their pistol.
Yeah, these guys had 9mm Beretta pistols.
Yeah.
They had revolvers because this was still the 90s. You could still find revolvers amongst police loadouts, especially. So there was 2 detectives who responded to the scene. Detectives still to this day carry revolvers. I don't know why.
It's cool.
I want to feel like a cowboy.
I don't know, man. I think it's probably just a style thing.
And the lucky cops had 12-gauge shotguns. Nothing they had penetrated their armor, and they were trying to aim for their head, but they couldn't because pistols aren't incredibly accurate at long range, and neither are shotguns.
Nope.
It's I'm someone who shoots guns regularly, and Yeah, you're not hitting a lot with like movies that bullshit like that, like the headshot at like 10 feet away with a handgun.
Oh, that's not gonna happen most of the time, unless you're like God.
Or John Wick.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, they weren't stopping these dudes. So the initial engagement with the police uh was kind of bad because while this was going on, all three dye packs, which were in the bag of money, went off at once. You know that like meme that's going around TikTok, the oh no, or like
Yep.
zooms it. I imagine that. Like this is like an incredibly dark moment to imagine that, but I imagine that on Philip's face as his bag of money just became completely ruined.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's anyway. So at this point, they would retreat back to their car. They were still trying to keep with their plan of escape. Their plan was always to get back to the car and basically shoot their way out because they pretty much realized they could overwhelm the police. The SWAT was on its way there at this time, but kind of just got stuck in LA traffic. And as weird as this sounds, because this is like the late 90s, and there would be the riots that would happen in LA. You'd think the SWAT would be really quick to respond, but it also like SWAT was a pretty new idea at this point. Like when I say new, I mean it was something that like had been put into practice but hasn't been perfected yet. Um, we'll talk a little bit more later about like our thoughts on SWAT, but like there's a need for SWAT like in this stuff, and it's you can tell like nobody ever expected like anything this to happen in America. Um, so at this point, Emil was shot in the arm and butt.
Damn.
Um, Phillips also caught a few police officers, including the detectives who I said who arrived on scene, trying to flank them by going through some neighborhoods and like shot at them. One of the detectives would be wounded via head wound from flying debris. Emil would get in the car and start the engine. I don't think he could walk really well because he had been hit in like the butt, which, despite not actually being quite a bad place to get shot, frankly, because it's mostly just fat or muscle and not a lot of veins there. Yeah. Phillips was in the shoulder. Then he got hit in his gun. So they were driving for a while and they were kind of like shooting. Phillips was trying to cover Emil and they were driving really slow. Emil was like shooting from the car while driving. It really is like a scene from Grand Theft Auto. So Phillips would get hit in the shoulder. His gun would also get hit, making him switch to a different gun because, you can just do that when you have like 7 guns with you at all times.
Of course.
But this gun kept jamming, so he finally pulled out his pistol until he was hit in his hand. Because like at this point, when like you have the police who are firing a ton of ammunition at you, like when you're charging that much fire, even if it's small arms, at 2 guys, there's a lot of bullets flying in that direction. Like I'm amazed there weren't any stories of like police accidentally shooting other police, just given how much ammunition was being fired by the 2 sides.
Mm.
Anyway, so Phillips got hit in the hand and he dropped his gun. At this point, Phillips grabbed the gun, got back up, put the gun under his chin, and fired it, taking his own life.
Yikes.
I think he kind of decided that they weren't getting out of this, and he wanted to have the final say in his decision. So at this time, Emil had abandoned their car and was trying to steal another vehicle. However, the police instantly shot out the tires. Emil managed to escape, no more harm than he already was. He came across another group of cars where he'd run into Bill Maher, not that one. This guy was just an aerospace engineer and he was trying to get to his job at the airport and had been blocked off by the police, and now Emil was trying to steal his car. Emil fired at the man, wounding him, tried to take his car. He'd also tried to break into a house of Dora Lubronsky, who thought he was just an intruder. Because I don't know how you don't hear all this gunfire and you think, oh, somebody's breaking into my house. So I don't know if the police know about this. I better call. Because of this, they thought there was a third gunman, and Marr was mistake, but they didn't shoot or arrest Marr. Marr got out of this okay. I'm glad to say that. So he then tried to steal Marr's Jeep. Now, a problem with this, Marr's Jeep was a stick shift. Emil doesn't know how to drive stick. So the car was pretty much useless. He only got a little far and then couldn't drive it. At this point, the SWAT team had finally arrived and began shooting at Emil. However, they noticed his legs weren't protected by body armor, so they just ordered to shoot at the legs. So all the SWAT team fired with AR-15s for him for about, I believe it was 2.5 minutes at his legs. His legs were hit about 20 times. Emil fell, surrendered, and was bleeding out. He would bleed to death, and his family actually sued because they believed that police didn't treat him properly. But you have a lot of arteries in your legs,
Right.
and like I don't think he would have lived either way. So this had ended the shootout. So some side notes of some stuff I couldn't talk about because it just didn't fit out. I already talked about our doctor who actually has become known as the bulletproof dentist in LA. And he's kind of like one of these people. They would later kind of put this all in the LA Police Department's museum. The police also sacked a gun store trying to use the weapons to stop them. They got like hunting rifles, but they never end up using any of these weapons to take them down because these guys just kept moving before the guys who were trying to take the guns from this gun store, could ever use them. There was also a news helicopter that was recording all this, and this is actually really cool. This guy was a Vietnam pilot, so when he flew into this, he just like went into instinct and started using evasive maneuvers he'd learned in Vietnam, which I can imagine must have also really sucked for that guy because you can imagine like being a Vietnam vet coming back like, oh man, this is just safe. I just like watch car chases and then there's a dude with an AK-47 shooting at you like a lunatic.
Damn.
Like, fuck, not again. Yeah.
I watched. So before we got into this, I watched a lot of that helicopter footage. So like as you're describing these events, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that happening. But it's grainy helicopter footage from way up above, and all they can do is just zoom in and kind of get an idea of what happened. So the guy who's talking over the footage is getting a lot of details wrong because he's just like in the moment. He's kind of just like guessing what's happening.
Yeah.
So what I saw was different than what was described. But I'm like, okay, yeah, because I didn't know I didn't know that Emil was shot, and I didn't know that Phillips killed himself. I thought Phil got shot by the police. That's what it looked like in the footage.
It was a suicide. Again, there's some sources do say Phillips was killed by the police, but the one that I found, it was a suicide. And I most definitely believe what was described to us about Phillips. I have no reason to believe he didn't kill himself.
Right. That makes sense. It makes a lot of sense, but like when you're looking at grainy helicopter footage,
yeah,
just zoomed in.
So I want to talk about like some of the post aftermath stuff. So now in the end up, the only people who were killed were Phillips and Emil. 350 cops were there. They fired 550 rounds of ammunition at the robbers. The robbers fired 1,100 rounds of ammunition.
Oh my God.
Yeah, that's a lot. And this was only 44 minutes long. Like there's actually a movie about this called 44 Minutes. And it's insane. Anyway, also Bill Clinton visits the survivors of the shootout, and some of the police were awarded with like medals decorated for surviving this, essentially. And because of this, actually, things like cop cars having bulletproof armor in the doors was put into place, and so were like a cop having a bulletproof AR-15 in their car. In fact, this also is why so the reason SWAT took so long is a lot of SWAT weren't actually working that day. Because SWAT does, so now there's a policy for most police departments, there has to be one SWAT trained officer on duty in the department. Like even my small county, there has to be one SWAT trained police officer on duty. And yeah, that's largely because of this. So now we're gonna break down. We're gonna kind of go in. So at this point, we're done telling the story of Larry Phillips and Emil Maturano. And we're gonna just talk a little about like what we think of this event. Now we've gone through this experience. Does that say like a fun thing?
Kind of an experience.
Yeah. So like, what do you think about this as like a whole story?
It's really interesting because a lot of what I learned was actually a lot about the aftermath and how the LAPD had to, and also police organizations across the country had to really reevaluate their situation. And as a result, a lot they've become a lot more militant and and they're more prepared to deal with this kind of stuff. And that response makes absolute sense
Yeah.
considering what happened.
Like, I feel like some people, like, they're very on the nose. Like, why do cops have MRAPs? Why do cops have tear gas launchers? And like, yeah, that stuff I feel like is very, like, yeah, the police don't need some of this stuff. But then you have people, like, cops don't need guns or, like, an AR-15 in their car. But, like, they kind of do.
Right. Like, what would they have done? Like, if that kind of thing happens again, what would they do if they didn't? And
Yeah.
a lot of it comes back around to this kind of stuff doesn't really you have there's like a lot of arguments about the role of police in our society,
Mhm.
and I don't really need to get into that, but a lot of these problems that we need police for uh, are entirely preventable by the fact that if we had, I don't know, paid a little bit more attention to these kids as they're growing up, they probably wouldn't have gone down that path. And then here we go. We don't
Or,
have this have a
like
shootout.
maybe let's make sure that these two guys who have been arrested several times before can't get their hands on guns.
Right.
But
It's
like part of me is also like this might have not been a stoppable thing.
yeah.
Yeah, like I think the police in this story, like I'd actually like if this podcast gets like a bit more traction and enough people start, I'd actually like to revisit this episode with like a police officer to
Right.
get it because I've like neither of us have any expertise in law enforcement.
No. And I also want to preface the fact that I'm a New Yorker. I've been in New York my entire life. I've never experienced the LAPD. I've never been to LA. So I have no firsthand accounts of how the LAPD has changed or how they currently like I a lot of my LAPD knowledge comes from uh more recent events. So I don't have any handle of LA history. Um what I do know is with not only my experience with the NYPD but also the history of policing in general. So I don't have a lot of specific knowledge about LA. But from what I do know about how this event changed policing in general, it's kind of insane because on one hand, it was an appropriate response because when an event like this happens, like, okay, we got to be prepared for that because that's insane and this shouldn't go down again. But at the
Just
same
keep in like I think we should preface it because we're gonna talk like right now we're just kind of talking about at least there's some other stuff I want to talk about regarding these guys, but also Columbine happens close around like I forget when it
right,
was. So I think there was a lot of events that were forcing police to change the nature of how they operated. Um, and because of that, like, and even today, police still have a lot to change.
hmm
Um, SWAT is a very good thing that works as a effective like thing for going hard in something the situation, but has yet to be a very effective response to active shooters. I think you're absolutely right. Like preventative measures, like maybe somebody should have taken in, Emil after he waved a chainsaw in his neighbor's face.
right.
Like, So I guess now it's like, so I want to preface this next part. Neither of us have any specialty in psychology, but like, what do you think of these two individuals?
I think that obviously they're problematic, they're criminals, but they're also, as I was getting at earlier, like these dudes are products of a broken childhood pretty much.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of bad history with their upbringing, and a lot of the stuff, a lot of crime just comes from that. And it's really heartbreaking knowing how people can be brought to those lengths because of their situations where they're growing up. So again, like when what you're saying, like yeah, they when they brought him in for waving a chainsaw and
They never brought, no, he wasn't even arrested for that.
right, but they like more attention needs to be paid to mental health of suspects.
Yeah, so this is a really like weird opinion I have, but I kind of feel like these guys were school shooters who made it past school.
I can see it.
Like more because they had a grudge against society than anything else. Even though it's never explicitly said, these guys, neither of which were really fond of society or law enforcement, both were loners in their own respects. Neither of them were able to hold a steady relationship. And things talked about like their obsession with firearms, guns, and other things really reminded me more about things I've heard about the Columbine shooters as individuals than anything else. Especially just how planned out. Because usually, like when you have rampages, like have you heard about that Tread documentary with the guy who built his own tank out of a bulldozer?
I've heard about that situation, and no, I didn't see the documentary.
One, we're probably going to talk about that on the podcast at some point. Two, he just kind of be somebody who was pushed to a certain point, but these guys always planned out what they were doing. It was never a spur of the moment thing, or was never a single event you could say was definitely, oh yeah, these guys become criminals. These guys were just kind of, I'm like, I don't know how to define them, but they seemed like they were two individuals who were very aware of what they were doing, and I don't even think they knew what their end game was.
No, I don't think so either. They're kind of it also just seems like uh, at a certain point, I don't even know if it was about the money. They kind of just liked it. It was
Yeah, I think it was like, and like there was a lot of things to say. These dudes liked things like that. I don't know, like Phillips was a bodybuilder, and he probably loved the adrenaline from doing that. And we went out for a meal, and like things like him buying that like motorcycle, really ridiculously fast motorcycle. There's like that's somebody who takes risk in life, and he like I think these are two guys who were always going to end up committing a crime. And unless there was anything intervening from the very beginning in their lives, they were set on this path.
yeah.
I think that on that note, we're gonna end this episode. Anything else you'd like to add in or throw in, Tyler?
Well, if you're a bully, cut that out because the kid you're bullying hopefully will not be a criminal.
If you are being bullied, put down the AK-47. Don't
Yes,
rob a bank.
seek help.
And if
Because
you're
there are
gonna
plenty
rob a
of people-
bank, please don't rob Bank of America because that's the bank I use, and
there's same.
I don't feel like getting caught up in that.
But if you are going through some tough times, there's always going to be people willing to help you. There's no need to resort to crime.
Or listen to a podcast like this one where two guys talk about stuff and you realize how much of a jerk you'll seem like when we talk about you too.
Hopefully,
All
you
right.
will not
On
feature
that
on the
note,
podcast.
that is all.